Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 27 of Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May between 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock p.m. Central European Time, we've been broadcasting live on our Zoom channel, our Facebook page, our YouTube, Awake TV, and a half a dozen other partner platforms. To about 10 to 15,000 people around the world as we gather together to really take counsel as to how we should understand the effects of the pandemic, how we can come together to ensure that the world beyond the pandemic is more sustainable and resilient and abundant and healthy and in alignment with natural systems. Every once in a while, we've been taking a break from the normal programming to just pause, step back, and have a dialogue with one of the leading commentators or thinkers or activists of our time. And I'm delighted today to be able to have that moment with Vandana Shiva, who I think all of you know. She's been one of the most, I would say, ardent and articulate spokespeople in the world over the last 20 to 25 years about the concerns that all of us have around globalization, the concerns that we have around Monsanto and the privatization of seeds, about the integrity of our environment and our soils, about organic farming and the encroachment of big pharma and urbanization and commodification. So Vandana Shiva is someone we've been looking forward to talking with. You may remember that she was on the women's panel the very first day that was moderated by Lynn Twist. And so we're very honored, Vandana, that you would circle back. And what I'd like to do is start with just basically a report from you of the effects of the pandemic in India. We've been getting sporadic news reports, but obviously, particularly with what happened with George Floyd several weeks ago, the media has been captivated by racism in America and around the world. So I'd like to kind of circle back and re-enter the effects of the pandemic, starting with what's happening in India and South Asia.
Of course, you know, in a strange kind of way, the violence against the Blacks and all colored people around the world and indigenous people everywhere, and the violence against the earth is so interconnected, but I think we can turn to it later. As India, as in so many other places, the pandemic really came on a plane, you know, and is therefore not just in its spread a disease of globalization, but in its basic causation is a disease of globalization. The first few cases were people who'd come in from China or other parts of the world where there had been, you know, tourists who'd gone to Italy, and then entire families had it. So the two places where a lot of the pandemic is still spreading were where these international flights were arriving. And then, of course, in the initial stages, it was very low. I think both because our diet, you know, I mean, now everyone wants turmeric and everyone wants ginger, but these are our basic diet. You know, Ayurveda is the basis of our eating. And so basic immunity buildup is what our food does for us. And I think that is one reason the fatalities weren't that high. But in the initial stages, the lockdown, you know, first there was no lockdown. All this started in January. By February end, you might remember, President Trump was invited to India for a Namaste Trump. And the town where he arrived has some of the worst cases, got the highest mortality rate. And a lot of people are saying it's connected to the fact that people flew from all over the world. Because these rallies are very often business rallies, they're very often trade deals. And so that town has a big problem. But Mumbai and Delhi are two cities which have big problems. Because the lockdown was announced very abruptly on March 24th at 8 p.m. to be implemented by midnight, everyone was stuck. No work, no jobs, no food. For the vulnerable part of India, who were forced to move to cities in the 30 years of neoliberal globalization, where corporations started to really dismember rural areas. And they came as precariat to the cities. But the lockdown then flushed them out. And the stories of their going home would break anyone's heart. A young girl a tribal girl, who had gone to as a worker in commercial farms, came back, walked back, died 1 hour away from her home in the village. And the stories of these deaths just mount up and mount up and mount up. Displaced workers walking back because they know no trains, no buses, everything was stopped. And it's only after 2 months that some trains started to move. But one of our biggest tragedies was these very tired workers were lying down on the empty train tracks because no trains were moving. And that day, a goods train came that way and ran over them. And the chapatis, the rotis they were eating were lying all over the railway track. So it's been, India, a lot of research is now coming out, should have come out much earlier, that East India Company was created, basically to take over India. We were the richest at that time, 25% of the world trade and economy. A new book has come out. 45 trillion was transferred from India to England through the East India Company and then the British Empire. But the same empire then connected, why were slaves caught in Africa to go pick cotton in America? People were making their clothes. India was making clothes for the world. But our economy had to be destroyed. And so to dump cotton made in Manchester and Lancashire, the land of indigenous people was taken, Africans were taken as slaves, and so much of the repercussions we are seeing today are related so much to this long period. And India has always been a fascinating country for the global extractors. We were super rich then, but even today, we've got the best brains in software. I mean, look at any software company, who's heading it? So we are not the market, but we are the brains. And that makes India very, very attractive for not just the new economy, but for agribusiness, because we're 1.3 billion people who feed ourselves. Now, can you imagine the opportunity? We could be prevented from having our seeds, prevented from having our food. This is my work for 35 years on agriculture, nearly 47 years in ecology. But I think the tragedy of India is because over these waves of colonization, so many people have been left poor, and they are facing the worst burden as the poor all over the world.
Yeah, and I also understand that that the Indian government is becoming increasingly authoritarian and nationalistic. And the comment that I'd like you to make in this regard, Vandana, is in relationship to the op-ed that Yuval Harari wrote in the Financial Times in February, where he said that the real challenge of the pandemic is not so much health, that we're going to restore health at some level, at some point. It was to democracy itself. And I'm wondering how the government there is using the pandemic in terms of the lockdown, in terms of the building of the concentration camps, in terms of the rising authoritarianism of the Modi government. What's your view of the, I guess, of the government in relationship to the pandemic and how it's being used or not for authoritarian purposes and surveillance, etc.?
So Jim, 5 years ago, I wrote a book called The Oneness versus the 1%. Oneness because we were rising into a whole new planetary consciousness. We were consciously starting to think of ourselves as Earth citizens. And these movements were growing everywhere, movements for the rights of Mother Earth, triggered in part by Evo Morales when he saw the failure of the Copenhagen summit. And he said, we were here to negotiate the rights of Mother Earth, not the rights of the polluters. And I'm going to go back home and call citizens of the world for a summit, People's Summit on rights of Mother Earth and climate change. And out of that grew the universal draft law on the rights of Mother Earth. And I had the honor and privilege of participating in that whole process, went to General Assembly of the United Nations. So we were having all this burst of energy, of a new kind of solidarity, a new awakening that we are one humanity on one planet, our common home. And at the Paris summit, I saw a shift in power happening. And I decided to study it. Where was the money going? Where was the power shifting? And realized then that this period of globalization had created a whole new class of billionaires. Yeah? If 1930, the Dust Bowl and the Depression had led to an end to the robber barons and all the antitrust work done at that time, and a convergence of regenerating the economy for people's work and regenerating the earth through conservation work, in a way, we could see everything was being undone. If you look at the graph, the inequality of a tiny percent controlling most of the economy, we had controlled it, we had distributed economies, welfare economies, it jumped right back in the last few years. And that same proportion of a handful of people controlling large chunks. And I opened my book with the figures of it, about 370 billionaires controlling half the wealth of the world in 2010. And then 3 years later, it was 170. And 4 years ago, it was 68, and then it dropped to 32, and then it was 8, and now it's 5. So I'm giving this background to basically say that this created a rupture in the way democracies work, because now democracies, instead of being of the people, by the people, for the people, ended up becoming of the billionaires who own the corporations. Yeah, because in the book, I was very puzzled. How did Bayer buy out Monsanto? So I did an analysis and found out it's the asset management funds of the BlackRocks and the Vanguards, where all the assets of the rich are used for betting and speculating. And during the lockdown, as more and more bailout was done for the rich, BlackRock, which is the world's biggest asset management company, was nothing in 2008. Wall Street collapse made it start to grow. It was about 7 trillion before the coronavirus. It had jumped to 23 trillion. Yeah. So we are talking about one asset management fund controlling this kind of wealth. India's GDP is about 3 trillion. So just divide 24 by 3, and you'll see how many Indias is there in one, the BlackRock. We also know how the Koch brothers in America worked on Citizen United, said, the power of money is freedom to speech. We can steal the elections. And everywhere then onwards, people were put in power who could perform 2 jobs. That had been tried and tested during colonialism. We have witnessed this in my country. First, transfer public wealth to the billionaires through all kinds of systems, privatization of the public system. The data is so clearly showing that it's only countries which have strong public health that have been able to deal with the corona. The graph comes down very fast like this. Wherever it was privatized, is when the graph goes up like that. And in India too, the privatization has been very severe. So the first is privatize the public good and close the commons. But the second part, which the British used, we threw out East India Company in 1857, the first war of independence. It's called the Sepoy Mutiny in British literature. But after that, the British realized, oh my God, these Muslims and Hindus all work together as Indians and they want their freedom. So let's divide them. From 1857 all the way to 1947, they worked at it till India was divided into a Pakistan and then Pakistan and Bangladesh. All of these separations are calculated. They're divide and rule policy. And everywhere in the world, these divide and rule policies are working. If in the United States, there is a new rising of Black Lives Matter, it is because white supremacy had come back in violence. But it is also feeding back into the protests. I mean, just in the last 3 days, look at the number of Black people. Innocent girl at a red light, just shot dead. Yeah. So you polarize society along the colors of the skin, Black and white, along our genders, men and women, along religion, Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Muslim. And because we are diversity, the beauty of humanity, we are like the earth, rich in diversity. The earth is rich in biological diversity of species. Human cultures have evolved to fullness with richness of diversity. So when the divide and rule policy starts to work, it can fracture societies in multiple ways. Mm. So I personally see all the leaders of today who are violating democratic norms, violating constitutions, as really puppets of the super rich who want divided societies. And that's why, for me, democracy must be reclaiming ecological democracy, reclaiming economic democracy, reclaiming cultural diversity. I always say, let's not be obsessed with these. They're all men, for one. The young girls from Finland and New Zealand, the young women are giving so much wisdom. And here are these fat, over-bloated egos, so full of themselves, zero quality of leadership. Let's not be obsessed with them. Let's think of our earth, think of our humanity, spread our loves. These guys, Hitler will pass. Let's prepare for a world beyond them.
Wow, you said a lot in a few words there. Speak a little bit more about the relationship between the privatization of wealth and divide and conquer. I mean, those are two of the pillars of, I would say, what Naomi Klein calls shock capitalism. And I think I'd like to hear more from you about, Vandana, is how their strategies are being implemented through chaos, because it always takes some kind of chaos for their policies that would be rejected in normal times by the public to be embraced as necessary under emergency conditions. So, your understanding of shock doctrine and the use of capitalism in times of duress to consolidate power and divide and conquer.
Yeah. Jim, I've always felt we've given too much importance to individual egos of men who've been made powerful by others who are using them to gain more economic power. I think even capitalism, we give it a life of its own. But when you think of it, did capitalism begin on its own? No. Colonialism preceded it for 200 years. Just brute theft of land, of lives, of human beings. So we should not ignore the roots of colonialism in wealth accumulation. Because when we only focus on capitalism, we think we give power to capital to create. And capital is just a construct. It cannot create anything. It has defined the creative forces, the earth, nature, and people, as mere inert inputs. And that violence, to me, is the most basic violence that is still continuing. When there is this extractive system, as in India, the East India Company, extractive system of taking away the share of the peasant from feeding themselves, and starvation and hunger and poverty started to grow. That's when people rebelled. And I did 3 years ago for Gandhi's Champaran and Indigo Satyagraha, I did a freedom journey beginning from the place in Meerut, 1857. And I saw the names of the martyrs. Half of them are Hindu, half of them are English, Muslim. So quite clearly, if the peasants are being ripped off, they'll unite independent of religion. So you have to make them forget their peasantness, their role as farmers. You've got to accelerate these constructed identities. And if, Naomi's shock doctrine was written after the whole Iraq thing, if you go back to that period, Samuel Huntington had written his fat book, The Clash of Civilizations. And there are parts in that really sends the shock to me. Like there's a part which says, you cannot know who you are unless you know who you hate. And then you cannot protect yourself unless you exterminate the enemy. But this is what Hitler's supremacy was, got to exterminate those I think as inferior. Yeah. Indigenous people had to be exterminated. Just look at the records in the United States, when 90% of indigenous people were exterminated, of how they really felt extermination was the only way to purity and cleanliness. But they're doing the same with biodiversity of insects now. They've got to be exterminated. So separation is the instrument of control over the earth, her resources, as well as extraction, both from nature as well as from society. And this is then made natural by making it look like capital creates. When it does nothing, it can't do anything, not as a piece of paper, not as a digit, not as transactions or speculation. It has no creative power, it has no productive power. So given that people are being pushed so to the brink, 1 billion people are without food, they would organize for food. They would organize for water, they would organize for livelihoods, for jobs. So how do you prevent them from organizing democratically for human rights, for democratic rights, for economic rights? By dividing. And then it keeps people divided both because I call them negative identities, because a positive identity comes from you being who you are. It comes from within. And a positive identity is an identity of place. And an identity of place shared by many people means the sharing of identities. It also comes from the positive identity. I'm a nurse, I'm a caregiver, I'm a teacher, yeah, I'm an actor. But when all of that is taken away and then into your empty vessel is poured, you are not so and so, yeah? You can only be yourself by seeing the other as an enemy, this construction of the othering, and then defining the other as an enemy is the basis of divide and rule, but is also the basis of constantly continuing the extractive system. So divide and rule, separation, division, and extraction go together. They're two hands that are joined together. One can't work without the other. Otherwise, democracy would do what democracies have always done, bring correction. And we have to find a new way to rise in our diversity. And that's why I wrote my book, Earth Democracy, that we have to find a way to deal with this new totalitarianism and this new authoritarianism and this new extraction.
Yeah, yeah. I'd like to turn to that in a moment, but before doing so, I'd love to hear your comment, Vandana, on the relationship between escalating climate change and the rise of infectious diseases and the pandemic. I think it'd be useful for people to really understand the direct connection between our refusal, inability to deal with climate change and the fact that we're experiencing both escalating extreme weather events and the spread of infectious diseases.
Yeah. So as soon as the pandemic started to spread, I wrote a reflection piece. It's called Ecological Reflections on the Coronavirus. And I was trying to understand, because, through my work, I know that, there was a monkey disease in the Western Ghats, the rainforest, when the forests were cleared, or the Ebola came from the forest. And if you add it up, about 300 new infectious diseases have come from forests in the last 30 years. But why have forests been destroyed? Because of globalization. And particularly globalization of a highly inefficient way of doing agriculture. Inefficient because it uses so much energy to produce bad food that's nutritionally empty. And also because even though all of this is done in the name of feeding the world, only 10% of the GMO corn, GMO soya, that has destroyed all of Brazil, the Amazon, destroyed all of Argentina, only 10% goes into food. The rest goes as biofuel and animal feed. So it's not a food system. But how does it spread? What makes it spread? First, because the myth has been spread that this is necessary for feeding the world. But one of the things that made me start saving seeds was Monsanto's claim that they invent the seed and seed is a machine and they have to have a patent on it. I said, no, the seed is not a machine, it's life in its wonderful expression of constant renewal and reproduction and multiplication. And sorry, you can't have a patent on it. Again, because we've been through Columbus's letter patent, the Queen Elizabeth's patent letter given to the East India Company. So we knew what the word patent means. It means grab what doesn't belong to you and own it as a monopoly. So why is soya spreading so much? Because for every acre of soya, Monsanto gets royalties. If they were growing other beans, the black beans that the Brazilians use with their rice, Monsanto wouldn't get back. So there's a push of things linked to royalty collection, just like in the British times, the fact that 60 million people died in India was because they were extracting taxes from the peasants whose land they had grabbed. Yeah. Basically, they were forcing the peasants to pay half of the value of production in cash. And that's why the famines were happening. So if you look at why are disease epidemics spreading, it's because we've invaded into the homes of other species, which a greed-based and inefficient system has done. In India, we have farmed the same piece of land, the same 2 acres over a century, and the fertility has been maintained. We've renewed it by giving back to the earth, because there's a big difference between the extractive economy and the circular economy where you give back. You give back to society, you give back to the earth. And the soil doesn't run out of fertility if you're constantly giving back to her. She can support you in the same place forever. Desertification of the land, Jim, for me is a desertification of the heart and the desertification of the mind that allows you to think that constant invasion is progress. So disease epidemics are coming from forest invasions, but invasions into our body by a totally bad food system, pushing things we shouldn't be eating. We shouldn't be eating GMOs. We shouldn't be eating food laced with Roundup and glyphosate, which is known to cause cancer. We shouldn't be eating food with chemicals and pesticides. And I'm so glad in Europe, at least some momentum is there to say we'll reduce pesticides by 50%. The movements are saying 100%. We don't need them. All of this then leads to chronic diseases. Diabetes has become an epidemic. Cancer is an epidemic. Neurodegenerative diseases all over. When you add the chronic diseases and the infectious diseases, the mortality goes up. So if you look at the United States, why are the Black Americans most vulnerable? Because they live in the most toxic areas, the Cancer Alley, New Orleans. They eat the worst food. They don't even eat food anymore because they're in food deserts. You know, they have to go to a liquor store to buy whatever junk is there. I don't think junk should be called food. You know, that's my campaign in India. Every few years, I have to do a civil disobedience. I said, plastic, fiber in flour is not food. Adding neurotoxins to oil is not food. I think we just have to reclaim our knowledge that the food we grow outside with biodiversity nourish the biodiversity within us, we are 6 trillion microbes within. So here's the disease part of it. But the same industrial globalized agriculture is a big fossil fuel guzzler, directly because of long distance trade, because of mechanization, but also through the synthetic fertilizers made from fossil fuels. Add it all up. I wrote Soil Not Oil before Copenhagen. About 11 to 15% is because of direct production. And that shows up as agriculture production and IPCC. But IPCC has another category of 15 to 18% because of land use change, which is deforesting the world for palm oil, for soya oil. And then we package everything and we process everything and we move it food miles. 1 kilogram of food moving around creates 10 kilograms of CO2. All of this adds up to another 20% of greenhouse gases. And then you have waste in these long distance systems and systems based on uniformity. 50% of the greenhouse gases come from the same system that is causing diseases, both epidemics of infectious diseases and pandemics of chronic diseases, contributing in a very large way to climate change. But of course, once climate change starts to happen, then malaria can move into colder climates. You know, chikungunya, dengue can start moving. So there's a cyclical relationship between the pandemics and the climate change. But both are rooted in a greed economy which calls itself scientific, but doesn't understand the science of ecological limits and ecological regions. Ignorant about it, you are ignorant.
Wow, beautifully put, my goodness. Say a little bit about your campaign against Monsanto. I think people would love to hear your crusade against Monsanto in India.
I've done my doctoral work in the foundations of quantum theory, which taught me, A, that everything is non-separable. It's about non-locality, that it's all about potential. There's nothing like essential properties. The blacks are stupid, the women are third rate. No. It's the potential. If you get the right context, we can all thrive. And uncertainty. I was forced to look at agriculture in 1984, the year where Punjab erupted in violence and the city of Bhopal had a leak of a pesticide plant. So I wrote a book for the United Nations University called The Violence of the Green Revolution. I did research for a program on conflicts over resources and wrote the book. That book then had me invited to a meeting on the new biotechnologies, which didn't exist commercially. But the idea that you could splice genes and move them across species had been established through recombinant DNA, on which the scientists had put a moratorium. They say, we know how to do it, but we don't know what it means. Therefore, we will have a moratorium till we understand better the ethical, ecological implications. And this was the Asilomar Declaration of 1972 by those who had created recombinant DNA technologies. At this 87 meeting, the old chemical companies are there. It was small. It was a small group, some UN people, some of us independent scientists, and the chemical companies. And they're now talking about how the future profits will come from owning the seed. Therefore, they must do genetic engineering in order to stake claims on seed. And they must have an international treaty, which became the Intellectual Property Agreement of GATT and WTO. And they said by the end of the century, 2000, all seed will be GMO and no farmer will be allowed to save seeds. And that's what intellectual property means, that if there's a patent on a seed, then any farmer with that seed, including the original seed, is treated as a thief. At the end of this meeting, I mean, my mind just blew. I said, this is an empire of a life. And on my flight back, thinking, what do we do when this kind of absolute power is self-assigned to those who were part of the killings in Hitler's Germany, who had been tried in Nuremberg, in the Nuremberg trials. IG Farben and all their partners, Bayer and Monsanto, are together against Mobe in Hitler's time, one company. So on the flight back, I'm sitting and thinking, and I make a matrix. I said the first industrial revolution was associated with an empire of cotton of the British. And what was the instrument of dealing with the violence of this empire? The non-violence creative power of a spinning wheel. That's why Gandhi pulled out the spinning wheel and said, we'll make our own cloth. We will not be slaves. And I kept thinking in my head, if today's industry is alive, they used to call it the life sciences industry. They've stopped using that word now. Then what is the spinning wheel of today? I thought for very long. I got home, I said, it is the seed. The spinning wheel of today is the seed. And then I did everything. I was working on dams, on forest issues. I said, there's enough young people who are in these movements now. I will concentrate on saving seeds, but I will also concentrate on understanding what these guys do. I call them the poison cartel because that's the expertise. They knew how to make poison. Then they've taken over the seed, but their skill is still poison. They don't know the seed. They don't love the seed. They have no understanding of the life of the seed. So I started to monitor WTO, GATT, and we created, before the WTO was created, the International Forum on Globalization, of which I was a founding member. And you know, the WTO was stopped in Seattle, which showed that people, when they organize democratically, have tremendous power. I worked with my government. There were different kinds of governments then. We were democratic, we were sovereign. We managed through our parliament to recognize that plants, animals, and seeds are not human inventions. Therefore, they can't be patented because only inventions can be patented. And this law has been the most powerful instrument to deal with Monsanto in India. They challenged it last year, and I was in the courts again, because they were now saying, but the seed is an empty vessel, Your Honor, in the Supreme Court of India. The seed is an empty vessel. It's the chemicals we pour that make it a Superman. And we had to say, no, the seed is not an empty vessel, and the chemicals are toxic genes of the Bt, which actually have led to emergence of resistance. In the bollworm, it's a failed technology. We got a law passed. I said, but farmers have been the breeders. We got a law passed to recognize that farmers are breeders and farmers' rights matter. We defeated Pepsi, who tried to sue Indian farmers on potato seed on the basis of that law. I have absolutely continued both doing the research on what GMOs do. I was appointed by the UN to be part of the expert group to write the framework on biosafety, which became a Cartagena Protocol on biosafety to the Convention on Biological Diversity. But I've also just given all my life to saving seed, promoting ecological farming, just working with the deepest love for the earth and our peasants and respect for the women. And all of Navdanya, the movement I started then, has grown to give us so many lessons. Because we showed, I sued Monsanto in 98, 99, because they entered India illegally with Bt cotton. And our case prevented them from commercializing. Even when they commercialized, we continued to monitor. We could show that the highest rate of farmer suicides were in areas of Bt cotton, where Bt cotton had become a monopoly. And of course, Monsanto was selling the miracle of GMOs. It's pushing Bt cotton on Africa right now, and they couldn't stand it. So I experienced firsthand over a decade, Jim, how the mafia works. How the mafia, which is big pharma, the mafia, which is big ag, the mafia, which is anything toxic and lethal that destroys life, how if anyone shows harm, they go after you. So I am well experienced in Monsanto's ways of functioning. And I'm so glad that, you know, Monsanto is gone and our work is still here. We are still saving seeds.
I asked the question in part, Vandana, because I knew that there was a happy ending to the story. And I want to ask you, you know, in light of that, you know, you took on basically a Nazi-initiated global poison mafia, and you won. And I'd like you to kind of parse that for all of us, because as you know, we need to win. The major indicators are spinning out of control. we're running out of time. And you're an example of someone and a social movement that took something on and prevailed, not completely, and there's more battles to be fought, etc. But what was it about your struggle that gave you the victory, I would say, and what advice would you give to people listening who, are taking on another kind of issue, are feeling like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, and every night it rolls back down? Tell us how you view your success and what advice you would give.
So Jim, even from childhood, my parents had taught us that if you follow your conscience, there's no part that's bigger than your conscience. And it's so true. You follow your conscience, which is telling you this is the right thing to do. Then in a way, these giants become little midgets, They become sad creatures whose greed is limitless, whose violence knows no bounds, and they can, bend to any low form of telling lies, manipulating science, letting farmers die and say, no, they became richer, paying scientists to tell lies. You see that, but what has to be your guide is the truth in you and your conscience. And the second thing that's so important is something that is in the Gita, Jim, amazing little book, Gita, which is really about life. It basically says, in any conflict and contest, of course you must engage in defending the right thing against adharma. And dharma is that which holds things together, which holds ecosystems together, which holds the integrity of life together, which holds social cohesion together. And adharma is that which breaks, which ruptures ecosystems boundaries and planetary boundaries, which divides and rules to conquer society. So the Gita basically says, do the right thing and then detach yourself from the consequences. So I would reduce it to a very simple lesson I've learned both by those who've gone before me, our history, my wonderful parents, is put your passion and reduce your ego. Because passion and ego don't go together. Passion is your commitment. And passion with compassion is a very strong force. Ego does two things to you. It makes you burdened, it makes you burdened with a false sense of self, but it also makes you, it dissipates you when you don't detach. That's why, a lot of young people say, I've just been in this for 6 months. Dr. Shiva, have you been at it for 5 decades? I said, don't put your ego into your work. Put your passion and your compassion into your work. And it regenerates you. It recharges you. You never wear out. You wear out when your ego is part of the equation.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Lead with your passion and reduce your ego. That's very sage advice. That's very sage advice. What priorities do you see globally for the progressive movement right now? I mean, if you look, almost every place, there's an urgent and dire crisis. Now we've got the pandemic. We've got all kinds of related economic and cultural and political issues. What we just experienced, George Floyd, that was very interesting to me, that of all the things that would come out of the maelstrom of the pandemic, it was race. And I'm not sure I fully understand that. There's been no movement, for example, of any kind of magnitude on any other issue since the pandemic started. But as you look over the next 6 months or 12 months, knowing, as we were discussing on opening night, that the scientists are telling us we basically are running out of time and we have about 10 years, climate change is spinning out of control. What are the priorities that you would put forward for the movement?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, Jim, the rule of money, and you can give it whatever name you want to. I call it the money machine because it doesn't have a mind, it doesn't have a conscience. The rule of money needs separation. It cannot exist with unity. Both because seeing unity in nature means it put a brake on its extraction. Seeing unity in society, it has to start respecting the democratic, diverse voices of society. It has to listen. So if you have to be deaf and blind, then you have to rupture and separate. So I think the most important thing for me is the 500 years of colonialism and its separations on the basis of race, of gender, of religion, the civilizing mission of defining all of us as barbarians. I mean, and Ayurveda, which is saving people all over the world today, it was banned by the British as a barbaric practice. And there were Ayurveds who continued. And I went for the 150-year anniversary for the oldest Ayurvedic college because I work on biopiracy. They had invited me. So we have to realize we are not separate from nature, A. Two, the diversity of our colors and genders and religions makes us richer, and we should just refuse to participate in the games of division and separation. And I don't think it was purely the killing of George Floyd. I think if the George Floyd killing had happened before the lockdown, you wouldn't have had such a reaction. Because everyone who's been sitting at home, losing their work, facing hunger, having to stand in queues at food kitchens and for food stamps, they have become, they realized they were George Floyd's. The ILO data is of the 3.3 billion working people, 1.9 billion are going to lose livelihoods. And they were already losing livelihoods. The young people 10 years ago in America were so burdened with debt with college, and they were frying French fries in McDonald's. After the lockdown, all of those young people, the whites who marched with the Black Lives Matter, they are seeing the future close on them. So I believe that this coming together is anyway happening because the crisis of humanity is making us realize we are one humanity. And that unity is becoming a higher felt experience and consciousness than the constructs of division. I think that's one reason this has happened. So talking about the next 6 months, at the end of it, the most basic thing we need is food. Food is what makes us. We are what we eat. Food is where the big giants, the Bill Gates, everyone wants control. Yeah? This is their next colony. 14 patents on a fake burger, 14 patents on impossible burger. Why would they do it? Because they're hoping they can shut real food down and force everyone to make fake burger and then collect royalties like Monsanto collected. Gene editing, we don't need it, it's fake. I mean, they just did it on an embryo and it failed again. One edit, 1,500 unintended changes in the genome. So we are talking of a new colonization, and therefore we need to learn from all the old colonizations and realize that if we have to be free, we have to defend the commons. Because I've done so much of this work for so long, the forest question, at the time when we were defending the rights to our forests and the Chipko movement was happening, I looked at the commons for 200 years. The British peasants did not allow enclosures of the commons. It's the same period when America was being colonized, African slaves were being taken, same period, there was an internal colonization happening. So I would say to all of us, that let us not forget that we are one humanity, who's one species on an amazing planet, and what connects us all is the flow of food. Food is the web of life. The nutrition cycle is the foundational cycle, and it's the rupture of that cycle that leads to climate change. If you weren't pulling out carbon from underground that has been fossilized by nature over 600 million years, and then burning it, and destroying the forest that would pull it back, destroying the organic soil that would pull it back, you actually have ruptured planetary boundaries. So carbon and nitrogen are the food that connects the biosphere and the atmosphere. It closes the cycle. When we shift, and this is my work, Jim, I realize just for saving seed and doing biodiversity conservation, we grow more food and feed 2 times India's population. If everywhere we had gardens, if everywhere local food economies were created, not only would we be able to resist the divide and rule, we would be able to reclaim our unity with the earth and our unity with each other. So it isn't trivially that I say, reclaim your food sovereignty, reclaim the sovereignty of your body, of your mind, because these are the new colonies.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, Vandana, thank you so much for the depth of your analysis and the power of your inspiration. It's very, very moving. The world is very fortunate to have someone like you present in the world today.
Jim, we are very fortunate to have a world that we are
yes,
called on to protect
yes,
with all our creativity, all our love. And as you said in the opening of the series, yeah, spreading the love is the powerful force, and just refusing to allow it to be mutated into fear and hate. If we cultivate love, we cultivate hope, we cultivate fearlessness. And that's our work. And once we do that work, the rest takes care of itself.
beautiful. Vandana, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's so good always to talk to you. And I'm sorry I'll miss Kim's poetry reading, but lots of love, Kim. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Vandana.
Bye.
Well, that was a tour de force if I've ever heard one. I mean, the power of Vandana Shiva, everyone, is really profound. You know, it's not that often that one experiences a human being that not only walks her talk, but does so with such acuity of the intellect and articulateness of the voice and passion of the heart that she drove Monsanto basically out of India. I mean, that is not inconsequential. That is an extraordinary achievement. You know, it ranks with the great personalities and social movements of our time. There's not very many that we can name that have been so successful. And as we agreed, we didn't get into the details of, you know, the insidious and nefarious ways that Monsanto continues to try to bribe and corrupt and pervert the Indian system to regain control and power. So we know that it's a never-ending struggle. You know, I was a part of the anti-nuclear movement in the United States, and we haven't had a new nuclear power plant built in, you know, 20 or 30 years now. So there are a few successes out there, but again, they're not many. And so Vandana Shiva was a beacon of light, and her advice to follow your passion and reduce your ego and do everything that you do within the consciousness that humanity and the world and the ecosystem and everything that moves is one, is probably the best advice one could offer at a time such as this. So I want to just acknowledge Vandana Shiva. And now I'd like to segue to our poet laureate of Humanity Rising. As you know from Charles Eisenstein, I wanted to have poetry and music from Claire Hiles as part of our dialogues. And we did it with Charles, and now we want to do it again. So Kim, I would love to hear your poetic voice as you respond to Vandana Shiva. And then after Kim is finished, we'll have some piano music from Claire Hiles. Kim?
What an honor to offer my voice in this river of passion that you, Jim, and Vandana have expressed here. And as I was listening to Vandana, I'm thinking a lot about voice and the power of a voice, the power of speaking a true voice. And, you know, in Vandana's last words, she said, you have to reclaim the sovereignty of your body and the sovereignty of your mind. These are the new colonies. And I find that what poetry can do is bring the body and the mind and the heart and the feeling self all together. Leonard Cohen said, there's a blaze of light in every word. It doesn't matter which you heard, the holy or the broken. Hallelujah. And so I want to offer about 10 minutes of poetry and music. Last time I thought there was music, but there wasn't. But this time there will be music, and the music acts, as one of my friends said, as an enzyme to deliver the poetry beyond the mind, so that everything that Vandana and Jim have said can melt into the heart as well, into the body, as we continue to deepen and deeply personalize this incredible teaching. I'm going to offer 3 poems by 3 poets from 3 different countries. The first is by Rumi, a Persian poet. The second is by William Stafford, an American poet. And the third is by Leonard Cohen, a Canadian poet. I'll tell you the names of the poems and the music in the chat after the poems. Rumi says, sometimes you hear a voice calling you, like fish out of water, hear the waves. Or a hunting falcon hears the drum, come back. Sometimes you hear a voice through a door calling you, like fish out of water, hear the waves. Or a hunting falcon hears the drum, come back. This turning toward what you deeply love saves you. This turning toward what you deeply love saves you. Children fill their shirts with rocks and carry them around. We are not children anymore. Read the book of your life. A voice comes to your soul saying, lift your foot, cross over, move into the emptiness of question and answer and question. Sometimes you hear a voice through a door calling you. Like fish out of water, hear the waves. This turning toward what you deeply love saves you. Children fill their shirts with rocks. Armies fill their hands with guns. Children fill their shirts with rocks and carry them around. We are not children anymore. Read the book of your life that has been given you. A voice comes to your soul saying, wake up, lift your foot, cross over, move into the emptiness of question and answer and question. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that makes the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood, storming out to play through the broken dike. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail, and if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I find it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what has occurred and not recognize the fact. So I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who speak. Though we could fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake. For a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes, no, or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. So I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. The signals we give, yes, no, or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. The darkness around us is deep. The birds, they sang at break of dawn. Start again, I heard them say. Don't dwell on what has passed away or what is yet to be. The wars, they will be fought again. The holy dove, she will be caught again. Bought and sold and bought again. The dove is never free. Ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. We asked for signs. The signs were sent. The birth betrayed, the marriage spent, the widowhood of every government. Signs for all to see. I can't run no more with that lawless crowd, while killers in high places say their prayers out loud. But they've summoned up a thundercloud, and they're gonna hear from me. Ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. You can add up the parts, but you won't get the sum. You can strike up the march, but there is no drum, and every heart will come to love, but like a refugee. And every heart to love will come, but like a refugee. Ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Thank you. That was a poem by Rumi called A Voice Through the Door, a poem by William Stafford called A Ritual to Read to Each Other, and a poem/song by Leonard Cohen called Anthem. And the music is by my wonderful collaborator, the cellist Jamie Sieber, Sieber, and I'll write all this in the chat. Thank you so much, Jim, for honoring me with the opportunity to speak poetry.
Boy, Kim, you left us as speechless as Vandana did. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. The power of word, everyone. The power of word is so sublime when used for the truth and for higher consciousness, as we've just heard from two extraordinary women. And now we would like to just bring our session to a close with Claire de Lune, that is being played by Claire Hiles. Rick, do you want to put it up? Thank you, Claire. That was an extraordinary piece and a perfect ending to our dialogue today and our poetry. And I want to just bid you goodbye by just calling to our attention a line that Kim recited just a few minutes ago, that what you deeply love saves you. You know, if you think about the advice of Vandana to all of us, follow your passion, reduce your ego, go for what is animating your life with everything that you've got. Let go of outcome. In the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita, she said. That's powerful advice for life, and particularly for all of us who consider ourselves activists. And I think all of that is summarized in that one line: what you most deeply love saves you. Let us all hold that in our hearts, everyone. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock Central European time, when we're going to be continuing our next installment of our program on strategies for change. Thank you. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Thank you, Kim.